Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this extremely important topic. It's nearly impossible to have good governance in a school system without effectively onboarding new members. There'll be a few tips at the end of this webinar for your criteria, what you think about as you select a board chair and other officers. But without further ado, I'd like to turn this to our colleagues with the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. And Ben's going to take the lead and introduce the primary presenters for today's webinar. Thank you, folks, for being with us.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you to the Vermont School Board Association for inviting us in from Wisconsin. We appreciate this opportunity. Going to see if I can get my screen to come up here, and I think we should be there now. So my name is Ben Niehaus. I am the Director of Member Services for the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. So pretty much the same role that Phil is in for Vermont. Before I turn it over to George and Pat, just want to give a little of my background. I've been with our association since July of 2021. Prior to that time, I was a superintendent for two small, far northeastern Wisconsin school districts. And really enjoyed that opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be here working for and serving our Wisconsin school boards. And again, we appreciate this opportunity to share with you of the onboarding process, because as you know, the work for new board members begins on day one, and it's a lot to take in, as you as experienced board members and school leaders are well aware. So we do what we can, always looking to continually enhance and support what we are doing and providing for board members, and encouraging our members to support their newest members on their local school board, on their local boards of education. So with that, I am going to turn it over to George and Pat Mans, two of our governance and search consultants, to lead today's conversation, and I will let both of them introduce themselves. So Pat, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Mans. Very happy to be with you today, share some thoughts on onboarding. As Ben said, critical to the success of new board members and the board overall. My experience, 33 years in education, 19 as a U.S. history teacher, 14 as an administrator, the last 12 and a half of which were a superintendent in the same small rural school district in northern Wisconsin. So with that, George.
Good morning. I'm George Steffen. I'm completing my 8th year working for the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. Before that, I was a superintendent for 29 years in 3 districts in both Illinois and in Wisconsin. And so I do this job because I still enjoy working with board members, and I find it a challenge, and also it's a wonderful opportunity to meet new people. So with that being said, I think we can probably then go into our PowerPoint presentation here. And I know there'll be time for questions as we move along. We have 3 goals for today's session. And you can see what they are right here. And hopefully at the end, you will say, yes, we've met these goals. The importance of new board member onboarding. We used to call it new board member orientation, and then the term onboarding got very popular. We'll take you through the 3 stages of onboarding new board members, and then our goal for you is that you're able to go back to your school district with at least one, and hopefully more than one, new onboarding idea. Okay, let's take a look at this list. This is what we think the ideal board member looks like, and I'll add a couple more along with it. Take a look at this list. They work collaboratively, not only with the other board members, but of course with the superintendent. And let me emphasize that first bullet point because it's so important. Being able to disagree respectfully is a wonderful skill for any board member to have. Passion to serve, of course, stays informed, is prepared for board meetings. That's a biggie. Helps the district set their vision and goals, of course, and so on. I think the last bullet point too, advocating for the district and the district students within the community. Okay, this is what a great school board member looks like. I would add two more. They're willing to listen when other board members or the superintendent are speaking, and never underestimate the power of listening. And they understand the role and responsibilities of a board member as separate and distinct from the roles and responsibilities of a superintendent. So with all these things, this is like the perfect board member, I think. I will have to say, very few new board members start out this way. It usually takes time to get these skills developed in a person who's on the board for the first time. Now, we want to define the term new board member, because that's open to question. Is it 30 days? Is it 60 days? When do you stop being a new board member? And I think the answer is, when we discussed this, I think it's about a year. And the reason why we picked a year is there's kind of a cyclic nature to the school year. Certain things happen at certain times of the year. Hiring staff, adopting a budget or a levy, evaluating the superintendent. These things happen usually at certain times of the year. So until you've gone through all of these activities one time, you're probably still a new board member. So it takes, I think, about a year for you to not be new. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. And so here's your choice. Here's basically your choice of any board. It's choice one: hope that new board members learn as they go by trial and error, or have a planned orientation program for new board members. Well, we're here today to strongly suggest the latter. Okay, so I want to take a look at these bullet points here. These are the reasons why we suggest what we do. We have many boards these days with fewer repeat members. We have less long-term continuity on boards. And I think the job of school board member is more complex than it used to be. And being new to the job is really difficult. And so I did not realize this when I was in my first superintendency. And I really didn't emphasize onboarding new board members until I was asked, to serve on a hospital board. I was in a smaller rural district, and I was asked by a member of the community to be on the hospital board. And I didn't feel that I could refuse, so I became a trustee on a hospital board. I knew nothing about what it meant to be on a hospital board. And I think I had been born in a hospital, and that's about what I knew about hospitals. And so I was totally overwhelmed. I had reports from committees, morbidity committees, tissue committees, and so forth. And I was onboarded by the head trustee and by the hospital administrator, who held a position that would be like a superintendent. And these two people basically taught me what I needed to know to be a good hospital board member, a good hospital trustee. And from that, I developed empathy for what it's like for newly elected board members coming on board for the first time, because I went through what they went through in my role on the hospital board. And so ever since then, I never took onboarding for granted, and we started doing it very consciously and trying to work with new board members to help them get acclimated to what is a very important and, as it says, very, very complex job. By the way, I should say that onboarding new board members should be done for all board members, not just some, all new board members. Now, there is a thing where you may have a former board member who was off the board for a while and who's coming back. that might be open for debate whether you want to onboard them or not, but depends how many years they've been off the board. I think that's the key issue there. If they've been on the board recently, they may not need a lot of onboarding, but if they've been off for a fair amount of time, things change so quickly that they may in fact need to have some orientation as well. So what I'd like to do right now is pass this along to my colleague, Pat, and he's going to continue with the stages of onboarding. Pat?
Thanks, George. So there's really 3 stages of onboarding, all of them important in their own way. Of course, there's this pre-election onboarding, post-election onboarding, and then ongoing orientation, as Ben talked about and George did. It's really at least a year-long process. The school district cycle, as noted, is very cyclical and has a tendency to repeat itself. So that ongoing orientation with new board members for sure is at least a year. So the pre-election onboarding process, it can be very context dependent. In other words, the context being with the second bullet point here, is it a contested election? Is it not a contested election? And so then the question there is, should they be treated differently? And, well, that's up to the individual district and the individual situation and context in that district. But certainly uncontested elections where you have a single person running for 1 open board seat or 2 running for 2 opens, there are things that you can do before the election happens where you can sort of get the ball rolling and get these people started before the election happens, obviously because there isn't going to be any issues there with it being contested. So when you get to the actual contact with the candidates, most of that contact is going to happen with typically the administrative assistant for the district, at least here in Wisconsin. That's the person typically that works very closely with the superintendent, works very closely with the clerk of the board to pass along all of the election information, make sure all forms are in and everyone who is running has met all the deadlines and has turned in all the important paperwork and so forth. So that's a lot of where that initial contact with the district for a candidate would come from. The superintendent, obviously, you need to be willing to accept calls, emails, other communication, being stopped at the grocery store by a prospective person running or thinking about running for the school board. Just be ready to answer those questions. And then, of course, along those lines for the superintendent or anyone else, other board members involved, make sure that you're treating all of the candidates and potential candidates even-handedly. The last thing you want is for there to be any accusations after the fact about this candidate or that candidate won or lost because of different treatment from district staff or fellow potential board members. So there are a lot of options for the post-onboarding or post-election onboarding process. It usually starts once a person is elected with a meeting with the board chair and the superintendent. This initial contact usually is just either calling or setting up a meeting to congratulate the candidate, welcome them to the board, their new position. You can have conversations here about the roles and responsibilities of a board member. There's a lot of misconceptions with folks who run for the board of getting on the board and what that's going to look like, what individual board member roles and the board's role as a whole group actually is within the district. At WSB, the consultants do an entire presentation with boards on roles and responsibilities of individual board members versus roles and responsibilities of the entire board. It's a good time during this meeting to share what the current board goals and norms are. If you have those, if you don't have those, it's a time to think about as you're bringing new board members on and organizational meetings, maybe setting those up. Next, of course, there are all of the processes and procedures and the creating of agendas and how all of that takes place. It's important that new board members understand this prior to the first meeting that they're going to take part in. And of course, when you get to committee assignments, usually you have your organizational meeting sometime right after the election, the next meeting after the election. It's important that these board members during this first meeting understand what each committee does, what its responsibilities are within the district, so that when it's asked at the organizational meeting of those new board members, which committees would you like to serve on, they have an understanding of what each of those committees are. Of course, it's also important, new board members are going to want to know a lot of information about the district and what and how to request that information and records from the district. It's important here during this part of the onboarding process to let them know that the folks that they'll be requesting this information from, have day-to-day jobs that are full-time and sometimes full-time plus, in addition to any request for information or records that individual board members would be asking for. At least here in Wisconsin, there are also some board policies and some state statutes that deal with how and what information can be asked and who can ask for that in terms of board members. And then finally, communicating with the community. It's important to have new board members understand that when they are communicating with community members, unless they are specifically tasked by the entire board to communicate with the community, when they speak, they are only speaking for themselves and not for the entire board. Many districts have an actual communication chain involving usually the superintendent, and in Vermont's case, it would be the board chair, as to what and how the board's communication is going to be with the community, with the media. And God forbid events happen within the district that require that communication. It's important to have that chain set up and have new board members understand exactly what that is and who will be doing the communicating. So continuing, things that can be dealt with, talked about in post-election onboarding of new members. Districts operate typically through a lot of documents. And some of those documents include strategic plan. Does your district have a strategic plan? If it does, it's critical that a new board member understand what that is, what stage of that strategic plan. Is it a 3-year, 5-year plan? Where are you at in the plan? And then that they understand that that strategic plan really drives the direction of the district, that individual aspects of that strategic plan really sort of drive decision-making and discussions that the board has based on priorities that are listed in that strategic plan. When it comes to the annual budget, education funding and school district budgeting can be a complicated thing. And it is, as we noted, very cyclical. It's basically the same process year after year in terms of setting that budget and then expending that budget, the board approving the budget. And it's important that at some point, which I'll talk about in a minute here, that you bring in staff from the business office to sit down with new board members and go over the budget process, as in terms of the annual budget process, the monthly budget process, expenditures, how the board is involved with approving those, et cetera. It can be a very difficult thing for a new board member to sort of wrap their head around initially. And every district, of course, has school board policies. Important to let new board members know where those are located, how they're located, where the access is, and how to get access to those policies. Important to let them know how those policies are updated, how they're changed. Usually there's a committee of a certain number of board members that work with just board policies. So to let them know what's involved with being on that committee. And of course, you basically make a lot of decisions as a board and as a district staff on what those school board policies say. So it's really important that they understand where they are and what their role is in managing the district. When you get to meeting packets, agendas, notices, other information that board members need for a meeting, it's important that they understand how that will be delivered to them, when it will be delivered to them, how they can ask questions about specific things, who to contact related to different aspects of that packet and agendas, where the district board meetings are noticed, how they will be informed or asked, are you available for a meeting at such and such a time and date. All of that information is important for new board members to really understand before the process of their year on the board gets started. Important to understanding a district's history as they're approaching coming on and being a new board member is explaining to new board members where they can find minutes of past meetings. Most districts have these located online where new board members can go and look back maybe for the last year or so. They can get an idea of that cyclical nature of the board meetings, what's talked about at each one, and any critical items that were approved or voted on in the recent past and not so recent past. That's all going to be found in the minutes of past meetings. And then, of course, one of the board's most critical roles is their role in the evaluation of the superintendent. That starts with, there may be discussion about how a superintendent, if you're in this position of needing to hire one, how is that process carried out? And then beginning from day one, board members need to understand that from their first day, what the process of evaluating their superintendent is, so that they can actually take an active role in that from the very beginning of being on that board as a new board member. So continuing on, other things that can be done with post-election onboarding new board members. As I mentioned earlier, meeting with other administrative staff. So, that could include the business finance director, buildings and grounds director, the administrative assistant who they'll be communicating with a great deal, principals of the district, assistant principals, athletic director, food service, transportation director, and members of a teacher leadership team. All of these people, if a new board member or board members can meet with them prior to getting on the board, it provides an overview of what each of their programs involves, their departments, their operation, what stage of development they might be involved in any one of those programs the board might be dealing with. And of course, it creates a start of a relationship among the leadership team, of which the board, of course, is a critical part. So it's important that you understand who these people are, what their role is within the district's day-to-day operations, and what they do. In terms of general setup for new board members, this is kind of where the technology folks might get involved. You want to make sure that you update your district web pages, identifying the new board members, and removing former board members that were on there. If members of the public and transparency is something that a district is interested in, you want to make sure that that's there and it's updated right when these new board members take their seats. Establish district email accounts, configure any other provided electronic devices. If they're given laptops or other devices they use for board meeting, it's critical that these are brought up to speed so that they're usable by the new board members to access their information about board meetings, and that everything is set for them so they're ready to sort of hit the ground running. Other online access, meeting applications, state association membership access. How do they get into the VSBA site? How do they access things in there? That's all critical to get set up and get that information to them as well. This is a great time to have them meet with district technology staff. So if they have any questions along the way or technology isn't working, they know who to contact to try and get that up and running when they need it. And then, of course, there are payroll issues for the district in terms of the audit process that districts are involved in every year. Board members in many districts are compensated for being board members and for anything that they might do in terms of reimbursement for trainings and that sort of thing. And at least here in Wisconsin, if a board member is declining compensation, that of course has to be dealt with. But all of that information, is their bank account up to date within the district's finance system so that things can be direct deposited, which many districts do now. All of that has to be taken care of as well. But it's easy to forget these things, but it's important that they're set up so a new board member is ready to go. And then there's, of course, additional opportunities to learn. Like Wisconsin, Vermont School Board Association has programs and new board member trainings. I took a look on the website, similar to Wisconsin's. All of that is listed there. It's important that new members understand how they can access that and that they can take part in those trainings and so forth.
Hey, Pat, we had a question from a participant. And
Sure.
Love to have you weigh in on this. If you're setting up a meeting for onboarding between the chair, superintendent, and new board members, what recommendations do you have if the existing chair isn't running and won't be a part of that new board?
And I don't know, George and Ben, you certainly can jump in here too. But to me, I don't know that that's an issue. If that person, the existing chair, has been on there, they obviously have some level of experience with how the board operates and all that information. So I don't know that there isn't anything there that they would not be able to share with a new board member. Of course, prior to a new board taking over whatever your timeline there is in Vermont, then you probably would have another quick meeting with new board members and the new chair. Or it could be a full board meeting with a new chair, obviously. But I don't know. George, do you see any issues with that?
No, I think it depends on if the outgoing chair wants to participate in the onboarding process. There's no reason she or he, couldn't do that. However, if the person isn't willing to do that, maybe another veteran board member, someone who's been on the board and is going to remain on the board in the next few years, could take that role and basically fill in the new board member on kind of the norms of the board and some of the things the board has been working on in recent years.
Oh, thank you, George and Pat. Those are the only questions right now, but we'll share others as they come in.
Thank you. Good question. So kind of lastly here, in terms of post-onboarding or post-election onboarding, board members will have expenses for training, development activities, board duties if they're asked to go and observe another district or observe another board, if they go to a state level training with VSBA. Usually there's methods for how that is accounted for. It's important that they understand what they're reimbursed for, what they're not reimbursed for, processes for record keeping and submission of those reimbursements. And then, of course, letting them know the timeline for how that works. It's sometimes difficult for folks to understand, even staff within the district. Okay, I expended some money to do something on behalf of the district. And sometimes there's an expectation that I'm going to get reimbursed, that next day. But districts typically have a financial and business practice. They cut checks on certain days. Maybe it's once a month, twice a month. To do that, to compensate and pay for these things along with the other bills. So when they're doing those check runs and that sort of thing, that's when that would take place. So it's just important to let them know when and how they're compensated or reimbursed for things prior to it coming up and being an issue. And then lastly, once, perhaps you're past that first year, then there's ongoing orientation, things that may start from the first year and go past the first year. Not sure what Vermont's process is with board mentors. And a board mentor typically would be another board member. Designating a mentor, however, is not a substitute for everything that we're talking about here today. And there can be pluses and minuses with board mentors. The plus, of course, that new person, new board member is benefiting from the experience of the veteran board member. Minuses may just be perceived minuses, but some boards have factions on them as a new board member is coming on. And depending on which mentor or person from the board, existing board that you assign them to, other members of the board, maybe on opposing factions, might feel slighted, or that this person is now a member of that faction. So there are potentially some pitfalls there and things to be cautious about when looking at the idea of board mentors with existing and former board members. It's important to have regular conversations with the superintendent, but it's also important for board members and new board members to understand, how do we do that? How often do we do that? The superintendent's job, having been one for 12 and a half years, is a full-time, sometimes 60, sometimes more hours a week job just in managing the district and the staff within the district and the direction the district's headed. When you add in things like unforeseen communications with the board or a lot of questions coming in, it can be a challenge. So it's just important for new board members to understand, not that they shouldn't ask questions or contact the superintendent, but just to understand and give them some context of what it means to be a superintendent and what their day-to-day job looks like. So does that look like a biweekly communication with the superintendent? Is it once a month? How do you get clarifications, questions and answers? Are there other people in the district? Is your process in the district contacting, say, the business office directly, or are those communications between board members and other staff coming through the superintendent and then to the other staff? Guidance through at least an entire annual cycle of board business is critical for new board members. However that happens, that can happen with the superintendent. It can happen with others in the administrative office. But it's important that new board members understand the process, the month-to-month operation of the district, what happens when, and that it is very cyclical and happens year after year after year for many of these things. And then finally, of course, what does full board development sessions look like? Is the board doing some of that learning on their own? Are they bringing in folks to do that for them in things like board retreats? Are they using VSBA and other resources to do that? But boards should always be, just like the expectation a board has of the district and district leadership, to be continuously improving. Boards should be looking to continuously improve as well. And then, of course, one additional thing that boards might consider there is, how are you reviewing how you do your business? How are you evaluating yourself as a board on an ongoing basis, so that you know if you're meeting the needs of your district and doing what your district is best for your district? What is your process for self-evaluation as a board?
Okay. One thing we just wanted to be mindful of, and that is the statement that you see here. With so many board meetings being live streamed and available to the public, the board and your meetings are really on public display more than ever before. And it's important that board members set a good example by modeling professional and ethical behavior. Not just adults may be watching, but students as well. And for the adults watching, some may be considering moving to your area and are checking out your school district online. So how the board conducts itself may have lasting impacts of which you are unaware. And I've spoken with board members, and they said, I didn't expect to be a role model when I ran for the board, but whether you like it or not, you are, because you're a public figure and you're in public meetings. So please be mindful of that, and I'm sure many of you are, as far as conduct in public and at board meetings.
George, could I just jump in for a
Sure.
second? I would add that is a great point, that you are on display, and not only does it impact what George talked about, but depending on how your board does its business and carries itself in those public meetings, can determine in large part the candidates that you're going to have for administrative positions, teaching positions. People are always out there watching what you're doing, saying, is that a district I would like to work in? Are these folks, if I'm a superintendent, that I would like to work for? So it's critical that you do everything in public professionally, ethically, and with a standard that you would expect your staff to uphold as well, because people are watching.
I wanted to chime in, but really just ask a question, because this slide is just invaluable, and something I say often. It is so important that the board realizes they're modeling whatever behavior, either the behavior they want or the behavior they don't want. And we had a question, though, that I'm sure you've experienced before. How would a school board address directors that do not model professional and ethical standards? What can a school board do about that?
This is a tough question, so we're throwing a hot potato back and forth here. It's difficult when you have school board members who do not follow the norms of the board, and most boards have norms, and by norms I mean something different than policy. A policy is a written statement that you have. A norm is usually something that's acknowledged, but it's not written down anywhere. This is the way we do things here on our board, and that's one of the things new board members lack often, is they don't know the norms of how things work behind the scenes type of thing, and at the board meeting. But I think it involves, speaking with them, that the board is a team game. It's not an individual game. It's not individual, and it is a team thing. And one of the board norms is often something along the lines of, if you have a public part of your board meeting where other people in the room may speak and address the board and bring up issues or concerns that they have, that they do not argue with these people, that they listen. And listening, as I said before, is an important skill for every board member, and not react. And when things are brought up for which board members are unprepared or not knowledgeable about, it's perfectly acceptable to listen, acknowledge what you've heard, and then indicate what will happen next with this, or who it will be assigned to for further study or whatever. But it's not necessarily required for board members to respond quickly on issues that they may not know about. And so to avoid that, many boards have a norm that we won't immediately address things, but we will maybe assign them to somebody to look into or whatever, so that they're able to approach things in an informed manner, rather than trying to just react quickly to what somebody has said in a public meeting. And other boards have norms that only the board chair will respond to those types of things. That's another way of handling it. Go ahead, Pat. Yeah, I know you wanted to add.
Yeah, I would add that in Wisconsin, we as consultants are sometimes called in to work with boards who are struggling with this very topic, right? And so we have presentations that help boards actually come up with and write board norms. And they will put them on a card in front of each board member for every board meeting, so that they can see several very simple, very easy board norms or expectations of behavior. How are we going to ask a question? How do we make a comment? What are the basic processes that we have in order to run an efficient board meeting that's going to show the public that we may have disagreements, but we're going to do it respectfully. We're going to do it in a manner that's going to follow a procedure and a process. And so, it's these kind of things are critical to make sure that everyone understands. And when you get to the idea of individuals coming on and having individual agendas, that's part of the process of onboarding too, that when you are on the board as an individual board member, typically you have no more authority over the school district than anyone at the grocery store that you might pass. The authority of a board typically comes with the board members sitting at the table in a quorum and voting on a certain issue. That's where a board's authority lies. So, though you may have board members that are not following board norms and that sort of thing, it's still up to the entire board to determine the direction of the district, what decisions are going to be made. And as George noted, it's critical that someone on the board, whether it's just open to each other, or it is the board chair, that is a person responsible for sort of policing the board norms, if you will, or calling out, hey, are we in a violation of a board norm right now? And one last quick thing I would say is it's important with this idea in this slide that everyone on the board, when they get on, shares, one simple moral imperative, and you can determine what that simple moral imperative is individually with your district and your board. But typically when we work with boards, that starts with, we're here for the students first. We're here for their education, for their safety. And that's our moral imperative. And it's a simple question. Is what we're discussing, the manner in which we're discussing it, is it moving us toward what's best for kids, or is it not? And that can be a very simple board norm. If it isn't, ideally you move on and you discuss something else, or you do it in a different way.
We do have a question for you all. When a community member asks to censure a board member due to their behavior, what does a board member do?
In Wisconsin, only the board community member can ask, but only the entire board could censure a particular board member. It's not something that's not a power that a community member has. There is in Wisconsin a procedure to recall public officials, which requires a petition and signatures and so forth and so on. And that has happened in some school districts, as well as
we don't have that in Vermont.
Okay, so that there is a procedure. but that involves quite a bit of outside work, and if it doesn't apply to Vermont, then that's not even one you would consider.
And I'm not
Okay, I
sure
have
what
another
Vermont's,
question. I'm sorry.
oh, sorry. I'm not sure what Vermont's process is for board members being censured, but typically on any board or any elected body, that's up to the rest of the board members, whether or not they're going to censure a fellow member.
Okay, I have another question. Do you think it would be better to have the key administrative leaders in the school come to the board meeting and give a 5 or 10-minute review of their job?
Oh, that's a good question. A 5 or 10-minute review. Do you mean an evaluation of their job? I guess I would have to ask a clarifying question. Carrie, would you mean when you say just go over what they do, or an evaluation?
Correct. I think that's what they're saying is for
Okay.
the new board members to have the administrators come to a board meeting and say, this is what I do.
I think it could be done that way. I think it would be more efficiently done in an onboarding session rather than taking, the whole board's time to do that for everyone, but to just do it for the new board member or board members in a onboarding session with these individuals. And as Pat had talked about earlier, part of the onboarding process could be to meet with a principal or principals, to meet with the curriculum director, to meet with the HR director or so forth, whatever administrators you have in the district, to find out more about their job. Because I have found that board members often not only aren't quite sure what the superintendent does, but they're certainly not sure of what the curriculum director does, or the HR director, or even all of the responsibilities of the finance director. So those meetings outside of a board meeting during as part of the onboarding process can be very valuable, as well as building relationships between the new board member or members and the administrators in the district.
I would very much agree with George on that, that it better takes place in a I guess a more private, intimate setting with fewer rather than more people, where questions can be asked and answered. And I guess, at least to me, it can kind of seem minimizing to ask someone in your district in any position to sort of summarize their job in 5 minutes. There's so much more involved in what everyone does than they're going to be able to try and explain in 5 minutes. So yeah, I agree completely. It should be done as part of a separate onboarding.
And just real quick to keep in mind that in a situation like that, that the meeting notice is properly posted with what that topic of discussion is expected to be, and always to keep in mind the caution that open-ended conversation like that doesn't snowball into further that wasn't properly noticed. I probably speaking more specific to Wisconsin law that, and I would assume very similar in Vermont with items that are going to be taken up by the board, even if it's not intended to be action item, if it's part of that agenda, that it needs to be on the agenda. So just to make sure, I think what both Pat and George said, better individually, more efficient use of the collective board's time. But if that is something the board chooses to do, to be sure that it's specific, not just in being time bound, but specific to what is the intent of that share, and being sure it doesn't turn into, for example, an informal evaluation in a public forum all of a sudden of the administrator that came in. I think we'll move on here. I think we have the board chair selection yet, George, and then I'll look to wrap up and we'll have some more time for Q&A.
Okay. All right. Board chair selection considerations. I would like to start with bullet number 3. Is it best to elect the newest member as chair of the board? Sometimes this actually happens due to, and Pat alluded to it earlier, rival factions on a board. When that happens, sometimes a newly elected board member who's not a member of either faction is elected chair for that reason alone. However, we believe the answer to bullet point number 3 is usually, and by usually I mean like 99% of the time, no, it's usually not a best practice to elect the newest board member as chair, even though I know it does happen on occasion. And the reasons for it are, well, you can see in the bullet points what goes into a really good board chair. It's obviously a leadership position, but look at the second bullet point: knowledge, experience. They may have integrity and leadership qualities, but they don't have that background. They haven't been on the board, so they don't know some of the things the board has been working on and some of the background information that the board has dealt with. And as far as building a culture of the board, I think it can be very difficult to build a new culture without any knowledge of the previous culture on the board, which a new board member would not have. So it's not really, it's an extremely difficult position to put a new board member into and make them the chair right away in their first meeting. And I think it's unfair to that person. When we look at what are some of the selection considerations that you should consider, I think it's kind of the bullet points more to the right, on the right-hand side. The board chair is obviously a political position. Notice that's a lowercase p. Understanding knowledge and relationships between people locally is going to be important. Who has the best people skills? That should be one of your considerations in selecting and electing a board chair. Of course, there's practical considerations as well. Who's willing and has the time and the savvy to get involved in and political advocacy, which is a big part of the board chair's responsibility. And then finally, who is trusted to promote the district and has to represent the district to all populations. And as Pat explained earlier, representing the district with media and so forth. So these are all parts of skills that are needed by board chair, and simply wanting to be the board chair doesn't necessarily qualify a person for that leadership position. So we wanted to just give you some background on this, but again, someone with experience usually is going to be preferable over somebody brand new coming on the board for the first time. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Ben, and we will wrap up and I think have some more time for questions. So Ben?
Sure. Thanks, George. Thanks, Pat. Trying to advance my slide here and it's like it's hung up. I'm going to the last one. Not sure why. I don't know if my computer hung up, but as I play with that, and I know the last slide basically was just a summary. Let's start with and go back to what we're hopeful that you took away from this is obviously at least one thing that you found that you maybe are not doing or you've identified as most important, or maybe it refreshes or renews what is that specific item that you should focus on. But there's a lot here. So if it seems a little overwhelming because it may have been, this isn't something that you've been focused on or doing, because it's, as I think either Pat or George said earlier, and I experienced this as an administrator. In the 10 years I was an administrator for 2 different districts. I had a 5-member board and a 7-member board. In 10 years, I had 3 changes among those 12 board members. So you may be finding yourself in a situation where all of a sudden there's this turnover. I don't know what Vermont's situation is. I think nationwide there's been high turnover. I know we experienced it in Wisconsin, probably being up about 40 to 50% more than a typical year. So hopefully you have something here to take away. We've provided some resources, but don't let it overwhelm you. Pull those key things out that will be of benefit. And in that initial conversation from where you are now in that pre-election onboarding through, you might get a framework of, hey, we're having the same question asked by the 2 or 3 candidates. We need to be prepared to bring them in or address those questions collectively. So I want to say, and I'm not sure why it's just going to advance to a Q&A, but for some reason it will not advance. So I think what I might do, unless you had anything you wanted to share while it's stuck on this screen before I stop my share and turn it back over to Carrie, we can take some questions for a few minutes, time permitting.
And
Yes,
if you want to stop, I can bring up the PowerPoint from my side too.
Okay, it really wasn't much more there. I don't know why I'm not froze up, but for some reason my screen is. So
we don't currently have any questions in the Q&A, but there may still be an opportunity, or in the last 3 or 4 minutes, we'll encourage participants to unmute and share their camera. Carrie can turn those features on if they're off. But Ben, now that slide's up, well, it was.
yeah, I saw it there.
Yeah, is there anything you want to underscore? I mean, I really appreciate that first point, which for me is be intentional, have a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Take something away, even if, like, when George opened, it's one thing. Take it away, be purposeful, be intentional in that. And I think the other thing, Phil, is jumping right to the slide at the end there, is this is a continual learning process. And as both George and Pat shared, yeah, typically you've got to get through a cycle. You have to get through 1 year. But as those listening who are many are veteran board members, you're continually learning, just as our students are, we all are. And that's what you want if you're going to be looking forward at and looking at continuous improvement in your governance, in your leadership of the school district, just as we look to continually improve in the classroom. So yeah, be purposeful. Take 1 or 2 things away from this. Because again, if you were sitting there like, man, there's a lot here, there's 20 things, how are we going to get those all in place in the next few weeks? Anything you take back and put in place is going to be more than what you have now. So it's ever evolving.
Right.
I will just share real quick from our end at the Wisconsin School Board Association. We actually have a new board member gathering we host in regions statewide about the 3rd week of April. And we just did a very comprehensive survey of our membership right 12 months ago, a year ago. And one of the things that really stood out is, hey, that's great, you're doing these things, but we need more. This isn't one and done. I think some of what we're talking about here, obviously, you have to have a starting point. And there's things you do want to accomplish, but it's continuous. So we're looking to enhance how do we actually follow up, maybe in a format like this, 20, 30-minute segments of breaking down what our new board member gatherings are that are hour and a half, 2-hour evening. Usually have a meal. It's a nice evening, but how do we dive in a little deeper? Because for us, even to do 90 minutes high level overview like that's a lot for those new members to take in, and with their veteran partners that may be there at the board meetings with them. That's a lot to take in, and it is good for those veterans. We actually just had one of our directors meetings, and one of our newer directors talk about somebody bringing something new in. Longtime board member, longtime board president said, hey, these things that we're doing in support of new board members are good for us all as board members, because we forget some things. We get a little, I don't know what the word is, stagnant in some, you get focused on some things. So I think it's good. His point was for the full board to be engaged and supportive of this process, because it can be good for them, and it can be welcoming, more welcoming for that new board member who has to get to work on day one as part of the board and has not been sitting there for a number of months or years like the others have.
We have some questions coming in. And the first one I may be able to help a little with. The first question is, our board has very limited onboarding procedures and definitely doesn't have a handbook for new board members. This would have been helpful 2 years ago when I was elected. Where would you recommend we start? And what I would like to say is that all new board members in the state of Vermont receive our Essential Work of Vermont School Boards book. As soon as I get the contact information from the superintendent administrative assistant. And that has a lot of information. It's the essentials of school board work. Secondly, coming up, Phil, do you happen to have the date of our upcoming new board member workshop?
Yeah, there are two webinars in May, and a bulk of our board members are elected on town meeting day, which is next Tuesday. But we have some districts that are bringing on new board members in all throughout the spring. So in May, we have two 90-minute segments that's similar to what Ben was talking about, with the intention of providing that entry-level scaffolding to be able to put information on in the future. I know Carrie, as a former board member, and I can both attest, it takes most board members a full 2 years to really begin to understand their job. So I think recognizing there's that initial onboarding and then the ongoing support that's provided by a mentor, the chair, the superintendent, really behooves a board to bring new members in and help.
Also, I'm sorry. Also on our website, we have a toolkit for new board members that includes a list of things that they should be looking for, like teacher contracts, paraeducator contracts, that are things that they should be looking at to learn more about their district. And that is the new board member toolkit found under our resource tab on our website.
I would just add to that, that from the district perspective, specifically the superintendent, just putting together even a 3-ring binder of important district information, demographics, student population, your latest state test scores, whatever other measures you might have or metrics in there for your district, budget documents, that kind of thing. Any and all things that we take for granted that a new board member would maybe not even think to ask for. You put that all together in a packet, tab it, and just hand that off to them, go over it with them in that new onboarding meeting. And it can sometimes sort of forestall a lot of the questions that they'll have as they're going on.
Great. I have another question. It's a very good one. I have 10 years board experience and am current chair. Any suggestions on how to integrate or not a new board member with a clear political agenda that is disruptive?
I think that's going back similar to the other question, when I guess that's not representative of the behavioral piece that maybe we were getting into of the norms and that. But somewhat similarly on that is we are looking at heading off or having these conversations, I should say, in going back to what Pat had said about that moral imperative is we are here to serve and be here for students. There's differing opinions. There's always going to be, whether it's in education, politics, whatever it may be. I was just at a forum here in the state of Wisconsin that was actually hosted by two former individuals that served in Congress of opposing parties, and they talked a lot about this, and I just share that in that it's going to be there. But I think the persistence of having the conversations in a reflective way to reflect back on what are we here for, what's the center of this, it's focused on the kids. We can talk through differences respectfully, but what's being brought, how is that going to benefit and help kids, if that's what the intention is, and everybody has to listen on both sides. So I don't think there's a easy, simple answer. I think in these difficult conversations, it's trying to get the reflection turned upon what are we here for? Why do we exist? The school systems were created to serve kids, trying not to bring those political agendas in. I don't know if George or Pat, Phil, if anybody has anything else to share, but that would be my piece is trying to take the conversation upon that moral imperative.
And I would just touch back on the idea that on a board, you're one individual
Right.
board member as part of a team, right? That board, you have no authority as an individual, except when you are sitting at that table, you have your one vote with the rest of the board in a quorum to make decisions for the district. You know, I guess the other idea is you have set processes for how you do business. They will be able to share their point. They will be able to disagree. They will be able to get out the information that they want to get out. But ultimately, if you have a process by which you're going to do your business and you follow that at every meeting the same way, it gets really difficult for one individual to disrupt the board's business.
Well, we had two other questions in the Q&A, but Carrie and I will answer them in a follow-up email to participants, and they're more specific technical things, and that way everybody will have the information whether they were on here live or not. We're indebted to you. Thank you so much, George, Pat, and Ben, and the Wisconsin Association for your time. Hopefully VSBA can pay it back someday.
Well, we'd welcome that. Thank you.
Yeah, greatly appreciate
Thank
it.
you, everyone. Really appreciate being able to share.
Carrie, any last word?
No, just we're here for our members. So, you know, if you have any questions, please don't ever hesitate to contact us, to send us emails, to give us phone calls. You know, phone a friend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all your work and all you're doing in serving students, and thank you for this invite. We appreciated it and enjoyed it.
It's great. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks.